The 1980s were marvelous for fantasy fiction. And here I am today to bring you my top 10 list. What I find to be the 10 best fantasy novels of the 80s. Will you agree? Check it out. Welcome back to Fantasy for the Ages. I'm Jim, the father of this show that my son and I do talking about fantasy, science fiction, and other nerdy things we enjoy. This is the fourth of a series of episodes I'm doing highlighting the best fantasy books by the decade. You can already go back and find my episode on the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s. But now we've got the 1980s today, and what am I bringing to you as a top 10? There are so many books now. So fantasy has exploded in the 80s and it has not slowed down. These lists get tougher and tougher as I go. But I've got 10 fantastic books to share with you here today. Some are continuations of series from previous decades. Others first got started in the 80s. There was a lot of that. And then there's some that are just standalone books, but they're so brilliant and inspiring to fantasy authors who are putting things out today that they deserve to be here on the list. Let's see what I thought should make a top 10 from the 1980s. Starting from the bottom, number 10, The Mist by Stephen King. This came out in 1980. It's not a very long book, but it's gripping. And this mist moving in over a town, and with it, all sorts of horrific and fanciful creatures that are quite willing to eat you. And focused on a group of people who get trapped in a grocery store when this occurs and how do they get out. This was made into a really good movie adaptation, though the ending is different from the book. So if you've seen the movie, well, you've got some surprise for you when you go back and check out the novel. It's not a very long one compared to other books like The Stand, which is a top 10 from a different decade. This is much shorter, but it's still classic Stephen King. Not when he gets a little weird and wacko and maybe was doing a lot of drugs or something. This is just straight good writing, and I think you would enjoy it. Number 9, Magic Kingdom for Sale. Sold! This is book 1 of the Magic Kingdom of Landover series by Terry Brooks, which came out in 1986. Back in the last decade, I put Terry Brooks on here for his Shannara series. This is something totally different. He wrote more than Shannara, and this is a fanciful tale that's quite humorous. And if you've never checked it out, it's definitely worth it. Prepare to laugh. You're going to enjoy this series. Number 8, Merida, Dragon Lady of Pern by Anne McCaffrey, 1984. Yes, this is back to the Dragon Riders of Pern. That makes 3 straight decades where Pern has put in a appearance. They're just such great books in this series. The Dragon Riders of Pern is a sci-fi series that really feels like fantasy and belongs on this fantasy list. Merida, Dragon Lady of Pern is just a powerful story. And it's set as a back in time book compared to the main timeline of most of the Pern books. It won't be the only book in the series that jumps back in time, but it really helps us understand how Pern and the people that we've met in the previous books came to be as they are. Really, it's a pivotal point in time that Merida, Dragon Lady of Pern, is set at, and very intense and relatable because, there's a pandemic going on in this book. Number 7, The Sleeping Dragon, book 1 of the Guardians of the Flame series by Joel Rosenberg, 1983. Great series. There's 10 books in the set. The first 5 or 6 are fantastic. The later books, not quite as strong, but if you really enjoyed the series, you'll want to read all of them. And The Sleeping Dragon, well, it's where it begins. You just got some college kids who enjoy playing Dungeons and Dragons and end up getting sucked into a world like Dungeons and Dragons, and they are their characters, but they're also still themselves. Is it just a game? Well, they find out pretty quick it's not just a game. And it's an amazing adventure with high stakes, creative decisions being made. I mean, what would you do if you suddenly were in a real Dungeons and Dragons esque world? Not as easy as you might think. And then if you actually could bring over into that world some of the knowledge you actually have in the real world, not just have to be your character, it's a good premise and it makes for a great tale. So, The Sleeping Dragon. If you have not checked these out, give them a try. Number 6, The Dragonbone Chair. Book 1 of Memory, Sorrow, and Thorn by Tad Williams, 1988. I haven't read this one yet, but I've heard a ton about it. It's high on my TBR. I'll get to it soon. I feel a little criminal that I haven't read this one because it's classic fantasy that people just absolutely rave about. And I felt, okay, 6 seems to be a good place for it. If you're a big fan of Tad Williams' series here, this trilogy, let me know. Is 6 a good spot on a top 10 list, especially when you hear the other 5? Does the placement feel right? I'll be interested in hearing your thoughts. Number 5 is the only other one on this list that I haven't yet read. And this one's, it's even more embarrassing I haven't got to, but The Black Company by Glenn Cook, coming out in 1984. The Black Company has been the inspiration for so much of modern fantasy. It had to go on this list somewhere, and I will read it soon. If I could read everything I want to read as fast as I wanted to read, I've already would have read a lot more books. But there is only so much time, and I do still have almost 1,400 books waiting on my to be read list. But this one's way up high. The Black Company is the first book in a series. Technically isn't done yet. And Glenn Cook still says, there are 2 more books that he intends to write, but he's not a young man anymore. I'm not sure we're ever going to get the finish. But that's okay. It's not like we've been left necessarily with a big cliffhanger. It's just there's more stories that could be told about the Black Company. But it started in 1984, and that's number 5. Number 4 is the start to another series, one that then lasts for decades. This is The Gunslinger, book 1 of the Dark Tower series, a 7-book set plus a couple of novellas. Well, 1 novella, 1 short story, written by Stephen King. This book came out in 1982 and was very different from anything else Stephen King had written up to that point. It is truly fantasy. He wrote a lot of horror and a lot of maybe fantasy adjacent tales, but it's fantasy. It's also science fiction. It's also Western. It is a real genre mashup, but solidly being called epic fantasy. I'm not wrong. Nobody would find that to be inaccurate. The Gunslinger is also the shortest of the 7 books in the set. So you read this one, you get grabbed by it, and then you're going to have to read the rest of the series to find out what happens. Thankfully, you're not reading this in 1982 because he took a long time to finish this series. While he wrote a ton of other books. It's like, this is his pet project that he'd come back to from time to time. And then he was hit by a car and almost died before he finished. So the last 3 books he pumps out pretty quick after he recovers from the accident. Of course, that had a fascinating impact on the conclusion of the story, which I just love. But again, it starts with The Gunslinger. Great tale all of its own. Little freaky, little weird, really good. Number 3, The Wish Song of Shannara. This is the 3rd book in the opening trilogy of the Shannara books by Terry Brooks, and this came out in 1985. There is a sharp, striking difference in quality from book one, The Sword of Shannara, to book three, The Wish Song of Shannara. The Wish Song of Shannara is where we really go next level with the magic that's happening amongst these characters and basically establish everything that's going to come in the future books and quartets. And it's a great tale all by itself. His idea of coming up with the Wish Song, which I'm not going to tell you what it is, I don't want to spoil things, but it's brilliant. He really got creative here and struck on something that he could use again and again in so many imaginative ways as he continues to write stories over multiple decades. So, The Wish Song of Shannara, strong book from the 80s, number 3. Number 2 is a book that starts off another epic fantasy series that's one of my favorites, and that's Magician by Raymond E. Feist. It came out in 1982, and it's the start of the Rift War saga, which was a trilogy, but also the Rift War cycle, which goes for well over 30 books. Trilogies, quartets that are all related to each other, but also encapsulated in mini stories that Feist would tell, or other authors would help him with, because he partners with authors like Janny Wirtz for parts of the series. But the opening trilogy was all Feist. Very classic fantasy, and yet with this introduction of a magical rift that combines two worlds, physical planets, allows traffic from one to the other, and an invasion, basically, of this one world that feels very classic medieval fantasy-esque, now being invaded by these warriors and magicians of a totally different culture. And the clash of cultures, the clash of armies, and the clash of magic is wonderful to read. And yet this world being invaded mid-Chemia has a rich background of magic and magical beings, including elves and dragons, that has so much that Feist can play with. Now, if you look this series up, you may not find Magician, because Magician in the United States was published as 2 separate books, Magician Apprentice and Magician Master. So you might find it as an opening quartet, but I think you can find just Magician, the way it was originally published, to be purchased anywhere now. Love this series. I've read the entire Rift War cycle, and while it has some high points and some slightly weaker points, all the books were worth reading. That opening trilogy, mwah. But now we get to number 1. Out of all the books from the 80s, what has just got that special high place for me? And I'm not going to say it is the best writing of the 80s, but it is my favorite story of the 80s in the fantasy genre, and that's Dragons of Autumn Twilight, book 1 of the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. It came out in 1984. This was straight from the world of Dungeons and Dragons, the planet Kryn, all the magic, the characters, the classes of elves and dwarves and Kender, the little, halfling types, half-elves, different classes, paladins, wizards. I mean, these things that I was playing Dungeons and Dragons when this book came out, and I'm like, yes, it's come to life. Now, Dragonlance inspired a whole thing, and there's almost 200 books available under the brand Dragonlance now, written by many different authors. Weiss and Hickman actually just finished a brand new trilogy, still in Dragonlance, still kind of a continuation of what came out here in 1984. I haven't read the most recent, but oh my goodness, these classic ones, love them. And if you somehow missed them, you owe it to yourselves to get those in. All right, that's where I'll leave you on this list. What do you think? Again, the comment box. Tell me your opinions of the books I put in the top 10. And if there's others from the 80s, because you've probably read a lot of books from the 80s in fantasy, you maybe have your own favorites. If you think some of them should have been on the top 10 or definitely would have been in your top 10, let me know. Put them in the comment box. I'll love reading and responding. Thanks for watching. We'll talk to you next time.